Welcome to the review of 10 Questions for Theists.
Today, we are going to be responding to Answers in Reason, which is one of my favorite atheist channels.
They're kind of like a cult, aren't they, Stephanie?
The intangible concepts that we can think of that are gods purely exist in our minds.
But just posing the question, I don't think that the intent is to commit to pretending it's true.
Because at the end of the day, it just seems like we're just making arguments from incredulity.
Hello, and welcome to the review of the responses we got to 10 Questions for Theists. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And today we're going to be covering off question 3, in which I asked about a favourite verse or story within your particular holy book. I left holy book to be quite general, as I didn't know what theists were going to be responding. However, the video responses we got were all from Christians. So these are all going to be from the Bible. There was a variety of responses, although there was a trend between them, and we will come to that trend at the end. But for now, we're going to kick things off with Braxton stream from Trinity Radio.
My favorite verse or story, I can't just give you a verse. My favorite story is basically the life of David start to finish, which is a lot more than I think a pericope or something like what he wants. But the story of David, I think, is just absolutely one of the greatest tales that's ever been told. I think it's true, but I think it's also an amazing story.
Yeah.
It's an archetype. I mean, look, you've got this young, like there's an archetype, there's a term for this archetype. I forget what it is, but it's the idea. It's the Luke Skywalker thing. It's the son who's somewhat dejected and down on it, depressed about the state of the world or whatever, or his position in his family. But then he meets an old guru. He learns what he needs to know to go off and be the hero against some enemy or something, right? Well, David has some of those qualities, right? As you're thinking about that. But the fact is that he also has some realistic aspects to him that make him more human, so that we can relate to even a guy like that. Like the fact that he committed some terrible moral failings, not only with Bathsheba and the incident that happened there, but also with how he dealt with his children later on. And really after Bathsheba, we never see David. We never see, I like the way that Steve Gregg put it. We never see the sheen on his kingdom that he once had before. It's not that God wasn't faithful to him, and it's not that he didn't live into his old age. It's just that it never was like it had been before that event. It's like his moral authority was gone. His kids didn't even seem to care so much what he thought about certain things. So, but that's making him more like me, right? That's making him flawed like I am.
You're not David, right?
Right. I identify with some of the worst things about David and almost none of the best.
So that was Braxton from Trinity Radio. Thank you, Braxton. He says his favorite story was the life of David. Essentially, it's a story about a shepherd who had strong, noble character and rose to be a king. And as Braxton says, it's basically the Luke Skywalker story, except he defeats a giant with atheists. I mean, rocks. Rocks.
Loaded up an atheist in a sling and fired away.
And to be honest, I like a story like that. I mean, it's quite a typical hero style story that people do like, and it's an underdog story. It's someone of good character that's come from nothing and earns a really good place. And I think that's something that all of us can be in tune with. Now, obviously, this particular story is also saying things like, it's better to fear God than it is a 9-foot giant. And if you have enough fear of God and love of God, and God will always be with you, then you can do anything. Which, again, I can understand is a nice story to have. Well, what was your take on it, Dave?
Pretty much the same as yours. I think it's that sort of old-fashioned tale that we all kind of like to hear. And I mean, full disclosure here, I always say, I don't really read the Bible, and I'm only really knew about David slaying Goliath until looking this up for this stream. So, but it's that old-fashioned tale where kind of like a rags to riches story, or guy with nothing who becomes everything. And I can see why people like it, and especially if you're a Christian, because it says, as long as you follow God, God will walk with you and he'll help you overcome all these things. And it's the founding of a nation kind of story. Everybody loves to hear a good nation founding story. So it's like Braxton says, it's an archetype, and it's the kind of story that we'll hear over and over and over again.
Most definitely. Thank you for that, Braxton. And next, obviously, on your stream as well, you had Pritchett, so we shall go with him.
Probably the Areopagus, Paul. There, if you look
What?
at Act 17, Paul.
Oh, Paul at the Areopagus.
Yeah, I mean, once you look at, and I know people are like, yeah, but I mean, not a whole lot of people converted, but he was also trying to get out of there without losing scalp, so, or a minimum of beatdown, right? So it seems once you look under the hood with the Stoics and Epicureans and the just the men of Athens, the religious people who were buying the system, and then the philosophy classes. And once you get under the hood and you just look at that thorough takedown and that divide and conquer strategy that he had, pitting them all against each other to get himself out of it, just because it matched it just that narrative is a story, plus it has his speech, which I'm interested in, in Greco-Roman speeches, and so it just has all the things that I'm interested in, and it's a thorough takedown of all their worldviews. So,
and it's likely
so it's just a matter of interest that becomes mine.
Who's the scholar that used to be at Southern, but yet he's kind of divisive? He and his wife are scholars together. People are divided over him.
David Garland.
Garland, yeah. I think it was him that said this, but I think it makes sense to say that Luke Luke made decisions, right, Jonathan? Don't you think Luke made decisions of what to include? And his take is that he included Acts 17 not only because it was important and it happened, but he included it as almost like a format for how you might dialogue with philosophically interested Greeks and pagans. Yeah. And so, and what is it? It's very, I don't care what anybody says about this. It's very obviously to me a classical apologetics approach. Yeah. He's showing some degree of respect or reverence for, or value at least, in some aspects of their pagan culture, because he's using those things as touchstones. Well, I backed off of respect and said value. Okay. He sees value in the altar of the unknown God, because he's going to say, yeah, that's the God I'm promoting.
He sees a point of connection.
Yeah. And then he does the same thing with the poetry, the pagan poetry. So it's got that, but then the classical method part of it comes in with, he's arguing for one God who created everything. Yeah. And then he goes on to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. Why, my goodness, that's what Norman Geisler and William Lane Craig and every other classical apologist does. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there. So you like Acts 17?
I just like it because it has some of my interests, just beyond the Bible and that era, and the literature and what's all in the philosophical traditions, and I just think it's a great story.
So that was Jonathan Pritchett from the Trinity radio stream with Braxton. First of all, sorry, Jonathan, for calling you Pritchard. It's the Welsh version, and I'm clearly Welsh.
Damn boy.
So I do apologise for that, but hopefully you can forgive me. And you said you liked Acts 17. So Dave, what do you think about that?
I can kind of appreciate this one as well, because when I looked it up, and like he says, it's about Paul having a dialogue with the philosophers and the Greeks at the time, and it's sort of a blueprint for apologetics discussion, so I can see why Jonathan kind of likes this one. And I kind of agree with the sentiment in that we should be having dialogues, we should be listening to what they're saying and having a discussion about what they're saying. And I also think many Christians could actually learn from this, not not just apologists, but Christians in general, because they don't really follow this idea of dialogue. They just kind of tell you that you should be believing. And like, I know lots of atheists do the same thing. But, more Christians could learn from this. And I actually kind of like the verse myself.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think, we're people that like the discussion anyway, aren't we? So something that's promoting discussions and the fact that there can be positives or, values that you can take on board yourself, even if you don't necessarily agree with someone's particular ontological position or whatever. There's still values that they might have that you can learn from, and ideas that you can take away and reflect on. And yeah, anything that promotes a positive discussion is all right in my book.
Absolutely. And it's funny you bring that up, because we'll be seeing that a lot as we go through these, where a lot of the people are mentioning verses that are worth us atheists listening to.
Oh, most definitely. So next up on the list is Craig. Craig Reed.
Who gives us a verbal beatdown.
Oh, he does, all the time.
Well, the verse I quoted this morning, the one is, all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purposes. That's what's written on my wife's mother's gravestone. And that's something we've used a lot in our family. Just that's one. The favorite story may be either the washing of the feet or the Good Samaritan. And then I'll keep thinking while you guys are talking. Those are the first that come to mind.
So that was Craig Reed with his answers. He gave 3 there. He gave 1 verse and 2 stories. So first of all, we'll address the verse, Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose, which I do think is a nice sentiment. But I think even within the Bible, there seem to be examples of this not happening. For example, the story of Job. Now, obviously, if there is an eternal heavenly afterlife, you could argue, well, he is going to be rewarded in the end. But it shows that there isn't necessarily a reward on this earth, and something about that doesn't quite sit right with me.
Yeah. And Job's wife and I think it's sons, they clearly love God, and they suffered for some kind of contest between the devil and God.
Yeah.
So, but I think there's another way you could kind of read this, in that it's saying that believers in God should unify and work together to produce a better world. Which
I agree with anyway. And I think even non-believers in God should work with everyone.
They should be doing it, yeah. And I think there's a lot of Christians and just believers in God that could do with understanding that and working together to produce a better world, rather than doing something like voting in Trump.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think actually the 2 stories Craig then mentions sort of backs up your point there, Dave. He mentions the story of washing the feet and the Good Samaritan. Now, everyone has heard the story of the Good Samaritan. It's been a very long time since I've actually read it, but essentially there was someone in trouble. They were injured, I think, lying on the street. And a lot of these Jews walked past them and they wouldn't touch them because they're unclean. And essentially a Samaritan comes and takes the person back to theirs and nurses them to health. And it shows that, you can be good even if someone is from a different culture. The right thing to do there is to look after someone in need. And I think that is a good lesson. But the washing of the feet is, in some ways, even more powerful. Dave, do you want to explain this one?
Okay. Again, I'm not a Bible person, but as far as I understand this, it's that there's the ritual where in Christianity, you wash the other person's feet. And in this instance, it's Jesus washing the feet of somebody who's very lowly. So it's an example of highest being possible, because, of course, Jesus is the incarnation of God, washing the feet of somebody who is unworthy, as some might, look at it. And it's an example that no matter how big you are or how great you are, you're never too great to help out the person at the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. So I think those are both great stories, and I don't think you even have to be religious to appreciate those stories. And I think that's another good thing about these stories. They can be applied to everyone, regardless of your faith, right?
Yeah.
Or lack of, if you will. And honestly, I think that stories like these from the Bible or any other holy book, or Aesop's fables, man. All of these moral stories are absolutely fantastic, and I wish people would take them on, just think about them more and apply them to their everyday life.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always been atheist, and that washing of the feet story is one that's always kind of struck me and stuck with me, because I think that's a valuable life lesson, and one that if more people took on board, the world would be slightly a better place.
So next we have Dry Apologist.
I don't really have a definitive favorite, but I do right now like the parable or story that Jesus tells about the woman who gives the one coin to the temple, and he says it's worth more than the people that were giving lots of money but had more left over. So it's in Mark 12, but that's the one I'll pick for now.
That was one of the recent readings in Mass, actually. That story. It's funny. The homily is always related to giving to the church and tithing and everything like that afterwards. That's how it seems like a lot of entryways in. But yeah, it's a good story.
And that was Dry Apologist with Mark 12. Dave, do you want to explain that one?
Okay, this has kind of a universal theme to it, and one that I think we all could draw some kind of information and goodness from. And it's the idea that a woman who gives one coin, although that one coin is a lot of what she has, so say she's only got 2 coins and she gives one of them, and that one coin is worth more than if a rich person gave 10 coins out of their 100 coins, because she's giving what she doesn't have to charity. So that is more valuable. I mean, in real world applications, I guess you could say it isn't, but it's worth more because it shows that she's more giving than people who give a throwaway amount.
Yeah, I mean, the value to her, at least, yeah.
Yeah.
The instrumental value might be less, but the actual value that it has to her and what she could do with it and what she has left is what's important. And I think this is one of the things, I know we've discussed this before, but frustrates me about like supermarkets and corporations that are asking for your donations when you make some form of purchase or something. Would you like to round up, or would you like to donate £10 today to this charity or whatever? Because for one, they're going to get a tax break from you donating through them. You're going to give them your money, they're going to pass it on, and they're going to get a tax break for their big donation. And realistically, if you're going to be donating, you should be doing it directly yourself, because you're cutting out the corporation. You're cutting out these. I mean, you think about it, right? These supermarkets and other corporations have millions, if not billions of pounds, dollars, whatever currency, floating around there in the background. They could easily do a hell of a lot to help people in trouble. But what do? No, they give it to the average person. And some of these supermarkets they do it in, they're clearly for people who aren't necessarily as well-to-do as others as well. Yet still they're passing the buck to the poorer person. And you know what? People will give to it. And to them, that's a big impact on their life. But it might not be that much instrumentally. And I just think that it's such a shame that these corporations do it that way rather than give a massive chunk just because they want to. Stop asking the average person to put money through your supermarket. Just donate the money. If you genuinely want to help, as a corporation, donate the money.
Absolutely. And at the end of the year, when they say we gave £20 million to Charity X, well, if most of that's come from the people at the checkout where they say, do you want to round up? You think you gave 20 million, but did you though?
Yeah. How much of that was actually you?
Yeah.
John actually mentioned something at the end of that as well, which he's noticed within his services, churches tend to actually use it as a device for donating or tithing, which, again, isn't what people are supposed to get from that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if a church is actually using it as a device for that, then there's probably something wrong with that. If a church is using it as a framing device to show, look at how much this person gave, someone in that state probably shouldn't give as much. It should be the people with 100 coins who give, 50, because they've still got another 50. Then, yeah, fair enough, right? I can accept that. Tell the people who can't really afford to give the money to not. And I think that's the way we should do it. There's too much guilt put onto people so that you should be giving this money over. And then obviously that goes up to things like the mega churches, the multi-million-dollar mega churches that just I mean, they drive me insane. They are the example of why churches should be taxed, because they're being run as a business, at least a mega church, and they should be taxed heavily. And the people who work there, who, not for profit bullshit.
They're clearly profit making when their ministers jump on TV and say, God says you should buy me a private airplane.
Yes. But yeah, I mean, those are really good though. So thank you for giving me that to think on, Dry Apologist. And the afterthought from John as well.
Yeah.
Speaking of John, he's up next.
I guess, I don't know, the verse that I've always been deeply connected to is actually similar to yours, Craig. It's in Genesis, very last chapter of Genesis, 50 verse 20, where the Joseph's brothers are begging for forgiveness from Joseph for treating him poorly now that he's sort of taken up this position of authority and rank. And then Joseph, in verse 20 it says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." There's this kind of interesting fact about God that, as the greatest conceivable being or greatest possible being, that even from actions that are explicitly immoral or what should not be done, God can still bring goodness out of that. That's sort of Aquinas and Augustine's sort of answer to the problem of evil, that even out of evil, goodness can be brought out. So I don't know. I sort of touched on that verse as a sort of touch on. As for a favorite story, I guess, or passage, from Scripture. I just like Genesis a lot. Like I kind of feel like the stories of the patriarchs are kind of like the the Iliad and the Odyssey. These sorts of more mythological or like larger than life sort of stories that are out there that you can kind of like really sink your teeth into and appreciate the like layers of symbolism there.
And that was John Buck with Genesis 50:20, and it reads, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And he draws it back to Craig's line from Romans 8:28 as well. He says it's sort of showing the same sort of thing. And it's actually an example of, the good returns, or karma, if you want to borrow from another religion, happening within life instead of the afterlife or next life. And he says that, he feels that it answers the problem of evil. But I think it really only answers some human evils. And it doesn't really answer it at all for natural or evidential evils. And I do see the point here, and it is a good example of works through God and how he moves in mysterious ways and all this. He let this bad stuff happen for a greater good. But I think, again, we've got the problem where in the real world, that doesn't seem to be the case. And I think that if we actually saw this happening in the real world more often, if every Christian who did their best to follow God's path and did good works through God and, grouped together and looked after everyone and, did the examples of the Good Samaritan, the person washing the feet, and so on and so forth, actually got there. And by there, I mean, did really well in this life, then I think you'd have a hell of a lot more believers. You'd have, and there was actual punishment or comeuppances on this earth for those that were not following that. Because we can't see into the afterlife. We don't know any of this and how it works in the afterlife and what the actual godly rules are. Because there are so many different interpretations of these rules within the Bible and by people who read the Bible. So it can be very difficult to actually go, well, this is what we should be doing. So yeah. Whilst I like it and I like what it's saying and I like the example that it gives and I am all for anything that promotes positivity, I think it still suffers a few issues.
Absolutely.
Did you have anything to add to that one, Dave?
No. I like your take on it and agree with it. And just to add, I would probably take Christianity a bit more seriously if there was that kind of moral transformation going on where all Christians were set about to transforming the world into the kind of, for want of a better term, the kind of kingdom that Jesus promoted, where Christianity will transform the world into this place of peace for 1,000 years. But we don't really see that happening a lot. No, not at all. We see some Christians doing it, but
yeah, exactly. So yeah, thank you for that one, John. I hope you don't mind my critique there. I was probably a little bit harsher to you than I was the others.
Please don't send Craig. Please don't send Craig around to beat us up.
So next up we have Triggerman 1976.
By holy book, he means the Bible. My favorite verse, just a statement that I could pull out of there. There's so many. I like so many. My favorite. It's hard to put a name on any one. But I guess if I had to, my favorite would be Deuteronomy 16, verse 20, justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live in the land and inherit it that the Lord your God has given to you. Now, of course, I would have to, explain some of the background behind that, but I would think that would be one of my favorite because it kind of sums up everything. As far as stories go, particular story, I am drawn to, believe it or not, it's a story about a woman, the Book of Ruth. I'm drawn to her story. I find her story to be just a gold mine, a diamond mine even. It's a beautiful story that I love to go back and read just because it's short and it's to the point.
Okay, so that was Triggerman. And to some extent, I kind of like this one. Like he says, the verse is, follow justice and justice alone so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. So I can appreciate the first half of this statement. We should follow justice. I'm not sure we should follow justice alone, because there's plenty more about the world that, that we should be following, but we should be creating just societies. We should be creating just relationships. We should be calling out people for injustice. But this idea of the Lord giving land to somebody and then following justice so that they can live and possess that land, I feel like there's something dodgy there because, is it really just to be given somebody else's land? Like if you think about Divine Manifest, Manifest Destiny, the Europeans going over to the Americas and taking the land off the Native Americans. They say God gave them that land. Is that really just? I'm not so sure myself.
No, good point. But I'm with you. I mean, I like the fact that justice is being promoted.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Any sort of virtuous behavior being promoted is good. And actually, I even wrote an article that I felt that a lot of Christians, when they ask what would Jesus do, are actually asking that question of about virtuous behaviors. And I think that is a good thing to do. They're obviously seeing Jesus as, how do you pronounce it, Dave? I can never pronounce. Is it Ubersmensch?
Ubermensch.
Ubermensch. There you go. But they are seeing Jesus as this superhuman, virtuous character. I know not all Christians necessarily do, but in general, they are seeing this as this paragon of virtue that we should follow. And in this situation, what would Jesus do? And they're asking themselves that question. And it's a good question to ask themselves. They're basically asking, how would a virtuous person act in these circumstances? And that is something we should all ask ourselves, not necessarily under the Jesus banner, but I think we should think about how would a virtuous person act in these circumstances. And we should think about that as much as we can. And we should think about it so much that it becomes habit, like saying please and thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So next up we have Exploring Reality, who is on the Spartan Theology stream.
For me, okay, so I wasn't thinking about a story. I had a particular verse in mind, and that's Philippians 2:3-4. And that's, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. And that's kind of like a philosophy that I just try to live my life by in general, as I try to like represent Christ in the work that I do and just my everyday life. But you also brought up stories, and I have a horrible memory. But it's a story in the Old Testament where, long story short, like this guy was expecting something and then he didn't get what he wanted. And then he sits under a tree and tells God to like let him die. And then God kind of works with him and gives him what he needs. Like it's almost like a story about a guy being so depressed with life.
Isn't that
God,
Jonah, like under the tree or whatever?
No, it wasn't Jonah. Gosh,
there is a part with Jonah or whatever with a tree.
Yeah, that's
the
a
worm
little
like
different.
eats it or whatever. But yeah.
But yeah, so there's this. The thing I really like about that story is, you have a character who's like so depressed that he wants to die, and he's crying out to God, and God doesn't tell him to just have faith. God doesn't tell him what to do. Like none of these things, right? Like what does God do? He just takes care of him physically, gives him like food, shelter, all this other stuff. And I really like that story just because I think there's a lot of stuff in the American church when it comes to mental health issues that get ignored. And I say that being somebody that's experienced that in the past. So I just like that story because it connects home and kind of gives a good example of what God might want us to do instead when it comes to people that have mental health issues.
And that was exploring reality. And he mentioned a couple of things there. The first was Philippians 2, 3-4. So it's do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. And I think that's great, right? That's even better than do unto others than as you'd have done unto you. That's do unto others as they would have done unto them. I mean, that's absolutely brilliant because I think that's something we should all try and do. It's not looking at another person and going, well, how would I like to be treated? It's looking at another person and going, how would they like to be treated? Now, we're not them, so we will get it wrong from time to time, and in fact, quite regularly, and it'll take a lot of practice to get it right, and a lot of questions. And people aren't always going to be as direct with their answers either, because they might be embarrassed or shy, or, it's a conversation they're not used to having. They might be going with what society expects them to say in this particular situation rather than what they actually mean. But once you get to know someone, if you actually take the time to get to know someone, sometimes you can read between the lines. And that's another thing we need to do. Take the time to get to know people and find out how best to treat them for them. So I am very on board with that one. So in fact, might be my favorite of the night.
Yeah.
Do you have any take on that one, Dave?
Yeah. Another way we could look at this is, like, your take is brilliant, and I completely agree with it. And I think another thing that could be added to it is that it should be looked at as we should be looking out for others, not just doing unto them as they would want to have done, but we should be looking out for them. So if you see a homeless person on the street, sure, you're about to have a hamburger, but that guy probably hasn't had anything to eat for a day or two. So rather than looking out for your stomach, look out for his. Sort of like Peter Singer's argument with the boy drowning, where if all you're going to do is scuff up your jeans, it's better to go in and save him than worry about your jeans.
Yeah.
And I think it's arguing something similar to that as well.
Yeah, fair. And I'd agree with that, actually.
Yeah.
Because, it talks about interests and ambition and all of that. Yeah. So, thank you so much for raising that one. And actually, you then bring up a story which you couldn't remember specifically. So we couldn't look it up because, You didn't remember where it's from. I mean, to be honest, I'm amazed as many people can remember the specific verse numbers and everything. I'd be an awful Christian. I'd be like, you remember that one about that guy in that place? He did that thing, right? That was a good story, yeah. And that would be every
it's
single
in one of the books of the Bible. You know it.
So, yeah, I'm impressed by everybody being able to bring up any, and the fact that you couldn't remember one, you know, you've done more than enough already. But this was a story about a depressed guy sat under a tree that was essentially taken care of by God. Now, what I like that you did, although you could argue it was a bit sneaky, was you reframed it and said it was basically an example of what we should all be doing, how we should be looking after each other. And I completely agree with that. But I think the average atheist or non-believer will look at this and go, well, if God has the power to help that guy, why isn't he helping out everyone?
Yeah.
You know? And I'd say, okay, yeah, that's fair enough. Why isn't he? Right? But the fact of the matter is, most of us either don't believe or actively disbelieve in this particular God. So why aren't we getting off our asses and helping those people? Especially, you know, I do think that there are better things happening in the world, more understanding with things like mental health, but it is still quite taboo. All the unseen illnesses. And do you know what? It's not just things like mental health. I mean, like autoimmune diseases and you know, people with chronic back pain and so on and so forth. There's a number of things out there that, because it's not a physical injury where you're tied up and, oh, look, yeah, it clearly hurts, they're really not appreciated by others around them unless someone's experienced something similar. And mental health feels, for the person, like the worst of everything. And there needs to be a lot more compassion. We need to do our best to look after these people. And part of that is probably trying to get people to understand mental health a little bit more and for it to not be as taboo. And yes, it's getting more and more normalized, but I don't know really how to reach people who think things like, you know, just getting a pair of sneakers and going for a run will cure you of depression.
Yeah.
Yes, it might make you feel better. But depression is a long, long battle, and you can even be happy for days, weeks, months, and still be suffering with depression. You know, you can be, there's a bit difference between feeling depressed and suffering with depression. And people who've never really suffered with depression don't fully get that. And that's just one of many mental health disorders that you can have out there. So, and do you know what? That was the Cliff Notes version. That was a really bastardized version, but that's because I'm trying to squeeze it into a quick video and not talk your ear off for too long. And I definitely suggest checking more out on the subject from reputable resources.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things I could say about this one too. I liked his take on how the verse shows how churches could be doing more for people suffering from mental health problems. And I think one way to look at it is there are churches out there that take advantage of people with mental health problems. Not all churches, don't get me wrong, but it would be wrong to say that there weren't churches out there that take advantage, that don't take advantage. And I think those churches could do with learning from his interpretation of this story, how they should be going out and helping. They should be checking on them, making sure they have what they need, which could involve making sure they get to the doctors and seek help. And I also think existentialists and humanists could learn a little from his reading. And because there's a lot that we can agree with that reading with, in that he's saying that God isn't going to help, so we should be doing this to work for God or do God's work through us, or however, And we as existentialists don't believe that God exists, so we think God isn't there to help. So we should be getting off our ass and creating the kind of world that we'd like to see and helping these people.
Yeah, definitely agree with you there. So, as I said, thank you so much for that one, Exploring Reality. A lot of talking points out of what you said, and a lot of things that anyone can think on and take on board regardless of their specific position.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've got our last video tonight coming up from Yovanny.
Two favorite verses I like. Mark 9:24. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief," which is relatable because I believe, but I have doubts, and I wish God helped me overcome my doubts. And then you have Matthew 16:26. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? I think that applies to anyone. I think that's good advice for anyone, really, regardless of whether you believe in God or not.
Okay, and that was Yovanny, who gave us a couple of really interesting verses. Let's start with the first one, which was Mark 9:24, and it's just a short verse that says, immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." Now, according to Bible Ref, which breaks this verse down and tells us what the meaning of it is, it's Jesus has told the desperate father that his son can be healed if the father believes. In a display of vulnerability, the father submits what faith he has alongside his doubt and fear. He is our example of someone who understands God wants all of us, not just the holiness of like the Pharisees and people like that. So in some respects, this kind of reminds me of the divine hiddenness argument. And it's the Bible stating that God wants non-resistant non-believers, and if they call to him, he will come and enter into a relationship with them. And I think you get a lot of the kind of Christians who argue there are no non-resistant non-believers. But even the Bible is admitting here that there are non-resistant non-believers. But in this case, God shows himself to this believer. But we don't always see that, and that's what the divine hiddenness argument is. If this was true, we would see God entering into more relationships.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, I mean, one of the things with the divine hiddenness argument, you can always find certain ways to weasel out of it, and they could say, well, obviously they're still somewhat resistant, otherwise they wouldn't be non-believers. And there's plenty of excuses around it, but I don't think that works. I can only speak for myself in truth, and I think that I'm very non-resistant. I spent a lot of time looking into various God and gods when I was having my doubts, and none of them came to me.
Yeah,
I got to a point where I was like, just any of you, like, just give me a sign. Come on, I want, So I think, and obviously based on a subjective experience, the hiddenness argument works because I have an experience, and the only person we can ever really say it actually works for is based on our own psychology, because we can only know if we are truly non-resistant in ourselves. But I think from testimony, we can say that there are actually a ton of non-resistant non-believers. And again, that adds more strings to the bow of the divine hiddenness argument.
Absolutely. And I mean, when you listen to a lot of deconversion stories, there are quite a lot of people who said they started having doubts. They called out to God for a sign. They prayed. They did everything they could to hold on to their faith, but nothing came.
Yeah.
Which, like you say, it's definitely a like an arrow in the quiver of the divine hiddenness argument.
Yes, definitely.
And Yovanny's next verse is one I really like, which is Mark 16:26. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good verse, though. He makes the comment there that he thinks that you know, a non-Christian can take from it too. And I think that depends on the person and how they're going to read it. Because if you're going to take soul in the literal sense, then you'll get people going, well, I don't believe in the soul, so that means nothing to me. But actually, if you give it a more charitable reading and you think about soul in a more metaphorical or poetic sense, then I think that we can come to a sort of agreement about what it would mean. And to give an extreme example, I mean, if you could own the world, but you destroyed absolutely everything that you loved and loved you in the process, and then you're left with the world, but nothing that really matters, you can sort of see that as an example. And then you can obviously whittle away and apply it to more real world things rather than like an incredibly extreme example like that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think you can take a more poetic reading. Like when we talk about soul, forget about this immaterial, intangible thing that exists within us, which is us. Think of it more in terms of like the soul of a painter or the soul of an artist. It's who we are, our passions, our desires, you know, what drives us. So if you take this as, what good is it to get all the things that we always wanted if we have to give up ourselves to get them? And I think that's a lesson that anyone can learn. What good is it to become the most famous person in the world if you have to hide away from the world then?
So yeah, you read it that way. Again, you're left with something that I think you can definitely learn from.
Yeah.
And this is something I have said to other atheists as well, is the fact that I do think that in various holy texts, there is always something that we can learn from. And yeah, okay, you can say you could learn the lesson elsewhere. That's fine, but that's not to say that you can't learn the lesson there either. You've got two science textbooks. They're different publishers, they're in different orders. You might be able to learn virtually the same lessons in both. But, you know, just because you can learn it here doesn't mean you can't learn it there, and so on and so forth. And there are lessons that I don't think that we necessarily do learn about elsewhere. It's not that we can't learn about them elsewhere, but they're lessons that you have to search out, especially ethical questions. You have to have an interest in ethics to go and search them out. Yet when you're reading the Bible, there are all these lessons here for you and can put those thoughts in your mind and get you thinking about these things. And it doesn't have to be the Bible. It could be any holy text. But you will find in all sorts of holy texts, or as I mentioned earlier, things like Aesop's fables. You know, there are plenty of good stories like that you can get a moral lesson from. And they're important. They're really important. All of these lessons. And I think a lot of holy books, if you strip away a lot of the mythology and the things that are clearly false, and you leave these stories, you'll find a lot of the holy books are talking about the same thing. And it's like, let's be excellent to each other, man. And this is how we should be excellent to each other. And yeah, awesome. We should be.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I understand that you can say, well, there's lots of immoral stuff in the Bible, so you can't listen to it. Okay. In textbooks that came out 20, 30 years ago, there's some bad science. There's stuff that's been proven false. It doesn't mean the good stuff in there isn't good anymore. It just means that there was some bad stuff in there. So you want to take the position that there's bad stuff in the Bible? Cool, I'd agree with you. But that doesn't mean that there isn't good stuff in there. And there is some good stuff in there. Stuff that we should think about. Stuff we should have discussions about. And if you want to rewrite those stories in a different way and talk to people about them so that they don't have to read it in the Bible, cool. I've got no problem with that either. Like, we should take the good out of things and make it as publicly available as we can.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think that's one thing I will say about a lot of the verses and stuff that people have presented us with here is that, okay, there's a lot of people that take the bad stuff from the Bible. There's a lot of American pastors and preachers who preach hate against homosexuality and things like that. And they're taking the really bad stuff out of the Bible and they're promoting that. But I think that says more about them. Yes, it's in the Bible, but look at the people who we've spoken about tonight who have searched out the good stuff, and even stuff that maybe might be taken a little differently. They've interpreted it to be the best interpretation possible. There's been overarching themes of justice, compassion, charity, looking out for your neighbor. And if there's people who say, let's get rid of Christianity, people need to stop believing this stuff, it's all bad, you're going to take all that stuff away from them? Well, what are you going to replace it with?
And what reason will you give them to keep following these good morals that they've found within their religion?
Yeah. And I mean, yes, you could argue here that, people don't need this to be good people. They're probably good people already, and because they're good people, they're taking this good stuff. Well, yeah, that's true. But they're taking the good stuff. That's what counts.
And hopefully they will inspire others around them that believe the same way that they do mostly to take the good reading from the stuff too. Oh no, that bit doesn't say that. The reading is, and then give it the most charitable and best reading and explain it to their friend who also believes in God. And all of a sudden that person's like, oh, yeah. And they've got a better reading of it. And you know what? I think that's a good influence.
I do, absolutely. And I mean, if you think about the way many atheists behave, who just yell at Christians, call them awful people, who are those bad Christians more likely to listen to? The atheist yelling at them, or the Christian doing his best to be what he thinks is Christ-like and taking the best readings? They're more likely to listen to that Christian than they are us.
Most definitely. But yeah, guys, thank you, all of you, for your responses. And yeah, as Dave said, there was definitely a very strong trend with ethics along all of you. There was a lot of promotion of virtuous behavior. And whilst I do know a couple of you, I don't know many of you that well. And you all seemed really genuine, and you all seemed, to give really good answers. So I really appreciate those. Now, I know there were a few of you who I didn't include in this one. There was a couple of reasons. Obviously, the length of the video would have been astronomically long. And there was also a few where there wasn't a real justification given for why you liked that verse. You just sort of said a verse. I couldn't give what I would hope would be the right reading on it. I'd be putting words into your mouth and into your head. And I just needed a little bit more information than you gave for why you like that particular verse. There are a couple of others that I didn't include, like Nathan, the first one that you said was actually the same as John Buck's, which was
Genesis.
Yeah. In fact, you mentioned you like the whole of Genesis, just like John did, although I did cut that bit out. But you also mentioned that you like Gen 5020 as well. So that's why I didn't include you there. But I appreciate all the video responses that we have had so far, and I do hope we get some more in the future. And as Dave and I have mentioned, if there are, especially others of a different position, we're always willing to come back and do, a question 2 or a question 3 part 2. We'd love, for example, some Hindu and Muslim and Buddhist, especially if you take a sort of a theistic version of Buddhism. I know it's generally an atheistic religion, which is why you wouldn't usually be responding to this, but there are many forms of Buddhism. Or, I'd love to have some of the more pagan religions, especially if you take them seriously, like Norse mythology or Wicca or anything like that. That would be absolutely fantastic too. So yeah, even though you think when you see these videos, these guys are already recording the responses, it's not too late. And even if we get to the end of the series, there's still time, because we are happy to revisit some of these questions.
Think of it as the air hiddenness argument. Just like you say that God wants a relationship, if you reach out, so do we.
I like it. And you'll actually get to be able to see real results here. So,
yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for sending those videos in, as I said, guys. And thank you, everybody out there who's watched us. You've been watching the review of the 10 questions for theists. We've done question 3 tonight. And I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
Have yourselves a good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
And the fool says in his heart, there is no God.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, that's my favorite. What's the one about how atheists are all going to burn in hell? That's my favorite.
That's a good one, too. That's one of my favorites. And yea, they will be smoten with great wrath, furious anger. The one from Pulp Fiction. That's also my favorite.